The deep dive is, well, it's really all about finding that essential, shimmering truth that's, hidden beneath these huge stacks of source material.
Exactly. Sifting through it all.
And today we are going way beyond the postcard image of, he's one of America's few true literary institutions.
He really is.
Robert Frost.
Most people, they know Frost from their school anthologies.
Oh, absolutely.
He's that friendly farmer thinking about a snowy evening, or, the guy who tells us to take the road less traveled.
Right.
But that very familiar, that folksy image, the homespun rustic, it really obscures a writer of, profound complexity, deep innovation, and, to be frank, just relentless personal tragedy.
And that is precisely our mission today. We've been handed this immense body of work biographical details, critical histories, all the analyses of his style, and a full accounting of his public and private life.
It's a lot to get through.
It is. So our goal is to synthesize these contrasting viewpoints. We're here to reconcile the public icon of American literature, the man who gave presidential inaugurations this sort of poetic gravitas, with the darker, deeply tragic, almost existential modernist figure that critics and, people like Randall, Jarrell in particular, eventually recognized.
And that reconciliation, it really matters. Yeah. It matters because Frost's legacy is so unique. Our sources all emphasize this point, that he achieved a status very few literary figures ever reach.
Which is what, exactly?
He became a public literary figure, almost an artistic institution. And the measure of that institutional status, is hard to overstate.
So we're talking about more than just being famous.
Oh, way more. He is the only poet in history to receive 4 Pulitzer Prizes for poetry.
4?
4.
Yeah.
That kind of enduring high-level acceptance from the literary establishment, it suggests a consensus about his genius that, often smooths out all the complexity. It takes it out of the picture.
So our job is to put that complexity back in.
We have to.
Right, so let's unpack this. A public titan, but one who is hiding this private and artistic darkness. To really understand that dichotomy, we have to start at the beginning. And the beginning is probably not where most people think it is.
Almost certainly not.
So if you, the listener, are picturing Robert Frost as, a lifelong resident of some rural Vermont town, you're only about half right.
Right.
His origins were surprisingly distant from the snow-covered stone walls he would later immortalize. Robert Lee Frost was born in San Francisco, California. On March 26, 1874.
It's a point that always catches people off guard. He was, initially a West Coast boy.
And his family background sort of explains the move, right? The volatility.
Absolutely. The nature of his parentage explains why the family dynamic was so volatile and why he eventually ended up moving east. His father, William Prescott Frost, Jr., he was involved in both media and politics.
A journalist.
A journalist and editor of the San Francisco Evening Bulletin. And on top of that, he had political ambitions. He ran unsuccessfully for city tax collector.
Okay.
His mother, Isabel Moody, was a Scottish immigrant. So you get this immediate mix of, Scottish intellectualism on one hand and this kind of hard-nosed American media and political ambition on the other.
It sounds like a pretty restless, ambitious environment to grow up in.
I'd say so.
But that whole world was, just violently disrupted by a tragedy and then financial collapse. So the move east wasn't some kind of pilgrimage back to the family roots.
No, not at all. It was a desperate flight.
A completely desperate flight.
When Frost was just 11, his father died of tuberculosis. This was May Fee, 1885. And this left the family, his mother, him, and his younger sister, completely destitute.
And the sources paint a really stark picture of that.
They do. They were left with only $8.
$8.
Just try to imagine that. And it forced them to move across the entire country to Lawrence, Massachusetts, where they had to rely on the financial patronage of his paternal grandfather, William Frost Sr.
And he worked in a mill.
Yeah, he was an overseer at a New England mill. And it was the grandfather who provided the means for Frost to return to the landscape that, he would later come to define.
That shift in environment must have been jarring. Going from the world of West Coast journalism to the strict oversight of a New England mill family, that had to have shaped his entire perspective.
Oh, for sure.
And this early instability, it seems like it was mirrored in his academic career, which is just remarkable when you consider how many honorary degrees he collected later in life.
It really speaks to the man's intellectual independence. He was always interested in learning, but he often rejected the structure of formal institutions.
But he had some early success in school.
He did. He graduated from Lawrence High School in 1892. He was the class poet and co-valedictorian, actually, alongside his future wife, Eleanor White.
Wow.
And that same year, he published his first poem in the school magazine. So the talent was definitely there, and it was recognized early on.
But the institutional commitment, not so much. He enrolls at Dartmouth College, but our sources say he stays for just 2 months.
2 months. Then he goes home. And then later, he tries again.
Yeah.
He goes to Harvard University from 1897 to 1899.
But he leaves there too.
He left Harvard voluntarily, citing illness. And the key detail here is that he earned no degree from either institution.
That's incredible.
And it's a recurring pattern, in the lives of so many great artists who they chafe against formalized learning. And even though he would later teach at the most prestigious universities, Amherst, Michigan, Harvard, he always kept this deep skepticism of academic rigidity. And that, I think, informed his rejection of certain modernist trends later on.
I think we have to just pause on those years right after college. That time when he was so desperately trying to find his footing, trying to balance his poetic ambition with the brutal realities of just making a living.
Those were incredibly hard years. They were filled with jobs he found completely unsatisfying.
Like what?
He worked as a teacher for, as the source puts it, unruly boys, which sounds like a thankless task.
To say the least.
He delivered newspapers. He even maintained the carbon arc lamps in a factory. Just think about that. This mundane, mechanical task so far removed from the artistic work he felt compelled to do.
But that experience with physical, often grim labor, that must have provided the authentic bedrock for the rural realism that, just permeates his poetry.
Absolutely. He knew what manual labor felt like, even if he wasn't particularly good at it.
And then finally came the first significant artistic victory, a real affirmation that he was on the right path.
Yes. In 1894, he sold his first professional poem. It was called My Butterfly, an elegy, and he sold it to the Independent of New York.
For how much?
The price was $15.
$15.
Which our sources calculate is roughly $545 today. And that small injection of cash, and maybe more importantly, validation, it must have been monumental for a young man struggling to prove his calling against his family's expectations.
And it seems like that affirmation led directly to a major life decision.
It did. He married Eleanor Miriam White in December of 1895, right after she graduated from St. Lawrence University. And their early life was, more struggle teaching, trying to make ends meet, and again, the patronage of his grandfather.
The grandfather steps in again.
He essentially bankrolled the next crucial period of Frost's life. He purchased a farm for Robert and Eleanor in Derry, New Hampshire.
And this is the famous dairy farm period.
That's the one. It lasted for 9 years, from 1900 to 1909. And it's so important because Freud used this period to really develop his voice. He was working the farm, but dedicating his early mornings to writing.
And this is where some of the big ones came from.
So many famous early poems, Tree at My Window, Mending Wall, they were born right there on that farm.
But the great irony here, and we'll see this irony repeated in his themes over and over, is that while he became the ultimate literary voice of New England farm life, he was a total failure at farming itself.
A complete financial failure. The farming endeavor just didn't work out, which forced him back into the one stable profession he had, which was teaching.
So he goes back to the classroom.
He taught English at Pinkerton Academy from 1906 to 1911, and then at the New Hampshire Normal School. He realized that to support his poetry, he had to teach.
And this period of struggle and, false starts leads us to maybe the most pivotal, almost unbelievable decision of his early career.
It's a huge gamble.
After all these attempts to establish himself in New England, he just packs up his whole family in 1912 and sails to Great Britain.
This move was absolutely crucial. You have to remember, he was 38 years old.
Right, not a kid anymore.
Not at all. And he had completely failed to gain any real traction with American publishers. He believed, and he was correct, that he needed a fresh start and a different audience.
So where in England did they go?
He settled first in Beaconsfield, in Buckinghamshire, just outside London. And within 1 year, he had his debut collection, A Boy's Will, published in London.
Wow.
In 1913. It literally took crossing an ocean for America to finally recognize its own native genius.
And the sources really emphasize that while he was in England, he didn't just publish, he connected with the intellectual heavyweights of the time.
He really did. He met several influential figures who were shaping the whole literary landscape. People like T.E. Home, the Georgian poet Edward Thomas,
Hmm.
and the great, facilitator of modernism himself, Ezra Pound.
And Edward Thomas became a close friend,
A
right?
very close friend. And our sources note he was the inspiration behind what is probably the most famous and certainly the most often misunderstood poem in the English language,
The Road Not Taken.
The Road Not Taken.
And that is such a fascinating detail, that a poem that everyone accepts as this ode to fierce individualism was really inspired by the simple fact that his friend, Edward Thomas, was just pathologically unable to make a decision.
Exactly. He couldn't decide which path to follow on their long walks and was always worrying about what they missed.
The path was always the road not taken for Thomas.
Always. It just shows how Frost could transform this mundane, everyday reality into a profound philosophical meditation.
And what about Pound? How did that relationship work?
Well, Pound gave A Boy's Will a favorable review. He was one of the first American critics to do so. But Frost, he later resented Pound's attempts to manipulate his American prosody.
He didn't want to be shaped by him.
No. He was fiercely independent, even when he was interacting with the powerful gatekeepers of the new modernist movement.
So he finally returns to America in 1915, right in the middle of the chaos of World War I. He has 2 published collections from London, A Boy's Will, and north of Boston, and he immediately buys another farm in Franconia, New Hampshire. And the rest, as they say, is history. But the key takeaway from this first part is that the Robert Frost we all think we know, the one who seems so native to the granite and pine of New England, he was forged not by success or a stable environment, but by failure, geographical displacement, financial struggle, and, the critical eye of British modernism.
That's it, exactly.
And that sets the stage perfectly for analyzing his style, because here is the great contradiction. He looked traditional, but the engine of his poetry was, in its own way, revolutionary.
His revolution was just. It was subtle. It was disguised as common talk. Frost's distinct approach was built on this uncompromising fusion of realism and language.
That's about how it sounds.
It's all about how it sounds. Critics consistently praise his realistic depictions of rural life, combined with his, unparalleled command of American colloquial speech.
There's a great quote from Ellman and Eau Claire on this.
Yes, they pointed out that his poetry shows a successful striving for utter colloquialism. He took the way people actually spoke, the idioms, the slang, the local accent, and he just elevated it to high art.
And this commitment to natural rhythm and intonation brings us to the core technical innovation he championed, especially when he was teaching. He called it the sound of sense.
The sound of sense is absolutely foundational. It's what separates Frost from his Victorian predecessors. He wasn't just concerned with the meaning of the words or the strict meter of the line.
So what was he concerned with?
He encouraged his students to account for the myriad sounds and intonations of the spoken English language in their writing.
So it wasn't enough to just write a line of iambic pentameter that scanned correctly.
No, not at all.
If a New England farmer would never actually say that line with that particular stress or pause, then for Frost it was a poetic failure.
Precisely. The meaning has to be conveyed not just by the dictionary definition of the words, but by the actual rhythm of the sentence as it's spoken aloud, where the voice naturally pauses, where it stresses a word, where it drops in pitch.
It's like the music of the language.
It is. He argued that these patterns convey meaning and emotion independently of the words themselves. It's similar to how you can recognize a voice pattern from another room, even if you can't make out the words being mumbled. He captured the essence of American conversational rhythm and then brilliantly poured it into classical forms.
And this is where the conflict with his contemporaries, the high modernists, becomes really obvious. Because while they were all busy tearing down structure, he was fiercely defending it, which leads to one of his most famous quotes.
Right. He famously rejected free verse, which was the dominant trend being practiced by Pound, Eliot, Williams, all of them. He described it as like playing tennis without a net.
He was adamant that those self-imposed rules were necessary.
He was.
But okay, if he was so committed to structure, why do we consider him a modernist? I mean, doesn't that rejection of free verse place him firmly in the 19th century?
And that's the brilliant paradox you have to understand. He believed the limitations of meter were actually liberating. They forced him to work harder to make the colloquial language fit the rhythm. And that ensured the language didn't just sprawl out casually. It was condensed, it was powerful, and it was utterly authentic to the sound of American speech.
The Poetry Foundation has a great line about this.
They nailed it. They said his work stood at the crossroads of 19th century American poetry, the traditional forms and modernism, the idiomatic language. He used the form of the past to house the voice of the present.
He used the net to guarantee a tighter, more engaging game.
Perfect way to put it.
And if we look at his philosophy on writing, especially in that 1939 essay, The Figure a Poem Makes, this focus on authentic expression over just, formal adherence really shines through.
That essay is mandatory reading for anyone interested in poetry. He wasn't interested in rigid academic exercises. He was interested in discovery.
And he lays out what makes a successful poem.
He does. And it's all focused on genuine emotional and intellectual engagement. The famous quote is, "No tears in the writer, no tears in the reader, no surprise for the writer, no surprise for the reader."
Mm-hmm.
And then he continues. "For me, the initial delight is in the surprise of remembering something I didn't know I knew."
That concept, the surprise of remembering something you didn't know you knew, that suggests the poet isn't just a craftsman following a blueprint. They're more like an archaeologist of their own mind.
Exactly, uncovering connections. He viewed the writing process as a journey of revelation. He believed poetry must be a revelation or a series of revelations for the poet as for the reader.
Okay.
And to get that profound, surprising insight, the poem requires, and this is his phrase, the greatest freedom of the material to move about in it.
Which is so interesting.
It's crucial. The structure of the meter gave him enough control to allow the material, the subconscious associations, the emotional memories, to move freely and establish these surprising new relationships.
And the material that emerged from that process, when you look at it closely, it was far from the pleasant pastoral scenes that America fell in love with.
Not at all.
Let's talk about the themes of his poetry, because this is where that duality is most apparent.
Thematically, Frost is just deeply divided between the light and the dark. And the critical reception, even early on, reflected this tension.
Who was one of the first to point out the darkness?
A critic named T.K. Whipple. He noted the absolute dark background of life in rural New England. Frost understood that isolation and indifference were central to that rural experience.
And you see this especially in north of Boston.
Oh, absolutely. His poetry, especially the dramatic monologues in that book, they often depict the loneliness of the individual in an indifferent universe. And he shows how that isolation could sometimes sink into total madness.
But for every critic like Whipple who saw the madness, there was someone like Harriet Monroe, right? The founding editor of Poetry magazine who championed the lighter side.
Yes, Monroe focused on the more comforting elements. She praised his sympathetic humor and his success in capturing the best of the Yankee spirit.
So she's looking at the resilience.
She chose to focus on the human reaction to nature's processes, the resilience, the community, the wry wit, rather than the stark indifference of the universe. And this critical split between the humorous regionalist and the bleak existentialist, it really defined the conversation around Frost for decades.
And one of the subtle ways he ensured his poetry had this dual layer, the simple surface and the complex depth, was through his literary influences. And these weren't just regional writers.
No, these were the heavy hitters of classical antiquity. The list of his influences is like a roadmap of Western literature. Thomas Hardy, Yeats, Keats, Emerson. He consciously placed himself within that grand tradition.
But the classical connections are maybe the most surprising, and they're the most telling about his intellectual rigor.
Completely. We often pigeonhole him as the heir to the 19th century American transcendentalists, but the sources point to this deep, deep classical foundation.
The classicist Helen H. Bacon made a strong case for this.
She did. She argued that Frost's deep knowledge of Greek and Roman classics profoundly influenced his work. And this wasn't superficial knowledge. She argued he was highly educated in the classics, likely reading them in the original Greek and Latin.
And she didn't just make a general claim. She provided some really specific thematic and structural connections.
Yes, she connected the recurring motifs in poems like Birches and Wild Grapes, that image of a person or a tree being bent down toward the earth. She connected that directly to Euripides' tragic play, Bacchae.
And in Bacchae, nature is not a peaceful thing.
Not at all. It's chaotic, it's transformative, it's capable of violence, not just pastoral calm. So the bending of the tree or the boy swinging on it, it carries this subtle undercurrent of Dionysian chaos and transformative power when you view it through that classical lens.
But why does this matter for the listener today? I mean, why should we care that he might have hidden a reference to Bacchae inside a poem about a New England birch tree?
It matters because it just blows up the folksy image entirely. If you read Birches simply as a nostalgic memory of a boy swinging on trees, it's charming. It's a lovely poem.
Right.
But if you recognize that the imagery is linked to Euripides' exploration of the destructive power of nature and the limits of human reason, the poem instantly gains this profound, universal and very dark subtext.
So the rustic mask was intentional.
It proves that it was consciously deployed to hide a sophisticated scholarly rigor. Frost was appealing to the masses while simultaneously having this very sophisticated dialogue with the greatest writers of history.
This inherent duality.
Right.
The man who spoke in the common tongue but built his house on a foundation of classical structure and existential themes. This is why his public success became so overwhelming.
I think so, yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about that success. The man who was writing these complex, double-layered poems became, by the mid-20th century, not just a celebrated writer, but, literally a national monument. His path to recognition was historic.
And institutionally dominant. His dominance is unparalleled in poetry. Winning the Pulitzer Prize once is a lifetime achievement. Frost did it 4 times.
4 times. Can you list them for us?
Sure. He won in 1924 for New Hampshire, which really cemented his reputation as the voice of the region. He won again in 1931 for his collected poems, which was an acknowledgement of his whole body of work.
Mm-hmm.
Then again in 1937 for A Further Range, and finally in 1943 for A Witness Tree.
4 times over a span of about 2 decades. That suggests a sustained mastery and a critical acceptance that is just astonishing.
It really is.
But beyond the prizes, the government itself, state and federal, embraced him fully.
He was appointed United States Poet Laureate in 1958. And on top of that, the state of Vermont took the extraordinary step of creating a position just for him.
They made him Poet Laureate of Vermont.
Yes, in 1961 through a joint resolution. This is official, institutionalized veneration. And it all culminates when he's awarded the Congressional Gold Medal in 1960, which was formally bestowed by President John F. Kennedy in March of '62.
And this brings us to the moment that perhaps most deeply etched that image of the beloved white-haired sage into the American consciousness.
The Kennedy inaugurations.
The Kennedy inauguration, January 1961. He was 86 years old, standing on that platform, the embodiment of American artistic heritage.
An iconic moment of immense historical significance. But the reading itself was, well, it was a struggle.
Right. He had composed a poem specifically for the event. Dedication.
He had, and he attempted to read it. But the sun was just too bright, reflecting intensely off the fresh snow, and it made the text on the page unreadable.
It's a perfect metaphor for life itself, isn't it? You're prepared for the big moment, but external forces just render your preparation useless.
Mm-hmm.
But rather than, stuttering or yielding to failure, he demonstrated the intellectual muscle that lay beneath that folksy exterior.
He pivoted instantly and recited the gift outright from memory.
And that poem, which begins, "The land was ours before we were the land's," speaks so directly to the core themes of American identity and ownership.
And by reciting it flawlessly under that kind of pressure, he transformed an incident of physical failure into this moment of profound, spontaneous triumph. It just cemented his role as the national poet sage.
And his elevated status allowed him to assume this kind of quasi-diplomatic role later in life.
That's true. In the summer of 1962, so this is shortly before he died, he accompanied the Interior Secretary, Stuart Udall, on a cultural mission to the Soviet Union.
And what was his goal?
His goal was deeply ambitious. He hoped to meet Nikita Khrushchev to lobby for peaceful Cold War relations. It's hard to imagine another poet being granted that level of access and public trust.
And it was during these later years that he divided his time between the institutions of New England and the warmth of the South.
He always spent his winters in Florida. In 1940, he bought a 5-acre property in South Miami. And the name he gave it just perfectly captures his wry, cynical view of the world. He called it Pencil Pines.
Pencil Pines. Why that name?
As the sources document, he named it that because, as he said, he had never made a penny from anything that did not involve the use of a pencil.
Wow.
It was a clear, dry statement that all his years of farm labor, teaching, and physical struggle, none of it ever amounted to the financial stability that his poetry, the work of the pencil, finally provided. It's an acknowledgement that art, not labor, was his only true source of wealth.
Okay, now we have to turn to the other side of this magnificent public coin, because this incredible success story is juxtaposed against a private life that was just a relentless series of heartbreaks. And I believe this explains the stark philosophical bleakness in the poems that critics like Jarrell would later analyze.
This is the shadow that defines him. Frost's life was plagued by extreme, sustained loss and mental health issues that ran deep in his family lineage. He and his wife, Eleanor, both suffered from depression.
And the specifics are truly heartbreaking. We need to slow down and really acknowledge the weight of this suffering. 4 of his 6 children predeceased him.
4. The losses started early. His first son, Eliot, died of cholera in 1900. His infant daughter, Eleanor Bettina, died just one day after her birth in 1907.
And it didn't stop there.
No. Later, his daughter Marjorie died in 1934 from puerperal fever after childbirth. And then his son Quarrel died tragically in 1940.
That is it's nearly impossible to comprehend, losing 4 children across 40 years. And then you have to compound this with the family struggle with mental illness, which often isolates the sufferers and the caretakers.
The instability was pervasive. In 1920, he had to commit his younger sister, Jeannie, to a mental hospital. She died there 9 years later. And then later, in 1947, his daughter Irma was also committed.
So this is a lifelong wrestling match with profound, debilitating psychological turmoil in his immediate circle.
Absolutely. This is the raw source material for the darker themes of isolation and mental collapse that you find in poems like Servant to Servants or Home Burial, which deal explicitly with the terror and strain of rural isolation leading to madness.
I find it astounding that a man could sustain that kind of public eminence-winning Pulitzers hobnobbing with presidents while carrying this private, crushing burden. How did he maintain the image of the wholesome Yankee sage when his reality was so relentlessly dark?
I believe the rustic mask became a necessary shield. The final major personal blow was the death of his wife, Eleanor, in 1938. She died of heart failure after developing breast cancer the year before.
And Eleanor was his anchor.
She was his emotional anchor and his co-valedictorian, the woman who had been there from the very beginning. Her death left him deeply adrift, and it contributed further to that sense of cosmic indifference we find in his later work. The public needed a simple, reassuring poet, and he gave them that simple exterior while preserving the complexity for the page.
Frost finally died on January 29, 1963, at the age of 88. He was buried in the old Bennington Cemetery in Vermont, and the epitaph he chose, which he took from his poem The Lesson for Today, is the perfect summary of this complex life.
The epitaph reads, "I had a lover's quarrel with the world."
A lover's quarrel.
It's an acknowledgement of conflict, a quarrel, but it's framed in the language of deep, complicated affection. This is the phrase that forces us to reconcile the public success with the private sorrow.
Okay, so let's discuss how that reconciliation actually unfolded after his death. The critical reputation of Robert Frost is not a static line. It moved through these dramatic cycles, almost like 3 distinct acts, reflecting society's willingness to accept the complexity beneath the mask.
The timeline of his reputation is fascinating. As the writer Charles McGrath detailed, at the time of his death in 1963, he was universally enshrined as the safe, benevolent New England folkie.
That was Act 1.
That was Act 1. Then came Act 2, the biographical villain. Everything changed in 1977 with the publication of the final volume of Lawrence Thompson's biography, which was largely critical.
And what specifically did Thompson reveal that caused such a rapid and dramatic reassessment?
Thompson's work suggested that Frost was, quote, a much nastier piece of work than anyone had imagined. It focused on his alleged literary jealousies, his personal cruelties, his demanding nature.
So it was a scandal.
A huge biographical scandal, and it immediately cast this shadow over his entire poetic output. Critics were suddenly forced to go back and look for the meanness and the darkness they had previously ignored in favor of the pleasant images.
It sounds like for a while there, people couldn't separate the man from the art.
They couldn't.
But then Act 3, he bounced back, but not as the folksy figure.
No, he returned as the bleak and unforgiving modernist. And this reversal was driven by intellectual giants like Harold Bloom, William H. Pritchard, and the Nobel laureate Joseph Brodsky.
And what was their argument?
They argued that the biographical details only confirmed the existential bleakness that had always been present in the poetry. They appreciated his controlled forms precisely because they contained such chaotic, modern psychological turmoil.
And central to this entire shift was the work of the great critic and poet Randall Jarrell.
Jarrell was foundational in establishing the darker Frost. He fiercely defended Frost against those earlier charges of being too traditional or sentimental, arguing that those standard views were just grotesque simplifications, distortions, falsifications.
So Jarrell's genius was in showing people how to read the poems differently.
Exactly. Not as simple stories, but as sophisticated, terrifying meditations. He's the one who established the portrait we largely accept today. The dark, desperate, isolated, frightened, and yet ultimately brave in his confrontation with the world.
And he defined the canon of the Dark Frost poems.
He did. Jarrell listed the key poems that he considered masterful, moving them from pleasant verse to high modern art. The Witch of Coos, Home Burial.
Which explores that mental health and marriage tension.
Also, Directive. the chilling contemplation of natural order and design, and the deep alienation of Acquainted with the Night. And crucially, he highlighted stopping by woods on a snowy evening.
And it's through that recontextualization that the poem is no longer just about enjoying the quiet of the woods.
No, it's about the temptation of eternal rest, the pull of the lovely, dark, and deep woods contrasted with the responsibilities that keep us tethered to life.
And this profound duality, it explains why his work is so woven into the fabric of global culture.
His influence is just so widespread. It crosses geopolitical and literary boundaries. I mean, consider the political resonance. Jawaharlal Nehru, the first Prime Minister of India, was so deeply affected by Frost's philosophical worldview that he kept a book of his poetry close to him until his death.
Wow.
That is a global testament to the universality of his themes.
And more recently, we saw his lines adapted for a moment of national mourning here in North America.
Yes, Justin Trudeau's eulogy for his father, Pierre Trudeau, back in 2000, he borrowed the language of stopping by woods on a snowy evening.
What did he say?
He took that final, resonant stanza, the promises to keep and miles to go before I sleep, and he rephrased it in this deeply personal and powerful way. He said of his father, "He has kept his promises and earned his sleep." It just shows how deeply his lines are embedded in our cultural lexicon, ready to be repurposed for solemn reflection.
We also see his poetry just permeating popular media, proving that his themes are instantly recognizable, even to younger generations. One of his most often quoted little four-line poems, Nothing Gold Can Stay, from the New Hampshire collection, became central to S.E. Hinton's novel, The Outsiders.
A classic, both the 1967 novel and the 1983 film. In that story, the lines are used to symbolize the fragile innocence of youth and the inevitability of loss. When the character Johnny quotes a stanza back in his final letter, it defines the entire emotional arc of the book.
The idea that beauty and purity are transient.
Exactly.
And that idea has transcended generations. It shows up in contemporary music, referenced by Lana Del Rey in a couple of songs.
A different poem, Fire and Ice, has had a massive influence on the fantasy genre.
This is fascinating.
The sources confirm that this 8-line poem influenced the title and many of the thematic tensions in George R.R. Martin's sweeping series, A Song of Ice and Fire.
So, Game of Thrones.
Basically, yeah. The tension between these powerful elemental forces that could end the world in either conflagration or endless freezing. It's literally articulated in Frost's short verse.
And it's not only Martin.
No. Fire and Ice was also used as the epigraph for Stephenie Meyer's Eclipse from the Twilight Saga, and it was even read aloud in the film adaptation. These examples just demonstrate that Frost is not a poet confined to dusty academic texts. He is the foundation for contemporary narratives of ultimate conflict and elemental tension.
And finally, his institutional legacy is cemented by the way his vast collection of materials is preserved. His ties to key academic centers ensure that this complexity remains accessible for future study. Where are the most important archival collections housed?
The Jones Library in Amherst, Massachusetts, holds one of the most important original collections, which Frost himself actually helped compile. It contains thousands of manuscripts, letters, artifacts.
And there are others.
Amherst College and the University of Michigan Library also house significant materials. But the sources highlight that the single most significant collection of his working manuscripts is held by Dartmouth.
Dartmouth, the very institution he attended for only 2 months before abandoning it to follow his own path.
A fitting final piece of irony for a man who always maintained a deep, complex, and sometimes antagonistic relationship with the academic world that ultimately enshrined him.
This deep dive has taken us on a remarkable journey. We've mapped the geography of Robert Frost's life, from a journalist's son in San Francisco, through those years of failure as a New England farmer, to his eventual coronation as one of the most decorated poets in American history. We've seen how he consciously built his innovative style, the sound of sense, by synthesizing colloquial American rhythms with classical poetic forms, all while navigating a private existence defined by staggering, repeated personal loss and mental illness.
His lasting influence, I think, it truly rests on his profound duality. He mastered the ability to present these stark existential insights, the indifferent universe, the pull of the void, the loneliness of rural life, all under the guise of simple, immediate language.
He was a modernist in disguise.
He was, in essence, a modernist whose formal control provided a necessary structure to contain the chaos and bleakness he observed. A truly complex heart beating behind that folksy, rustic facade.
And that profound conflict brings us right back to the phrase he chose for his tombstone. I had a lover's quarrel with the world.
Yes.
We've explored the immense, sustained suffering he endured, the death of 4 children, the mental health struggles of his closest family members. It was a life that gave him immense success, but also relentless, unbelievable pain.
Given all that context, the accolades, the sorrow, the deep, abiding need for order in the face of chaos, what does that phrase, a lover's quarrel, mean to you?
That's a great question.
Does it sound like a weary resignation to an indifferent existence? Or is it a defiant, enduring declaration of affection toward a difficult world, acknowledging that the pain itself provided the material for his most powerful art? It is a complex riddle Frost left us to contemplate, forcing us to explore that line between despair and enduring love for a difficult life.
A truly profound thought to end on. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into Robert Frost. We hope you are leaving today not just well-informed, but newly curious about the complexity hidden in those famously simple lines.